They thought they could throw me out after I handed them a $2 million deal. 6 years of blood, sweat, and late nights building this company's biggest contracts. And they fired me the morning after I closed the deal of the century. The betrayal stung. But what really got me was their arrogance, thinking they could just take credit and move on. What they didn't realize was that I'm not just good at closing deals, I'm even better at reading the fine print. And that contract they were so eager to claim? They should have read it more carefully. I'm Madeline Carter, 35 years old, and until last week, I was the director of business development at Sterling Dynamics, a supply chain management software company headquartered in Denver. For 6 years, I poured everything into that place. Weekends, holidays, relationships that withered because I was always chasing the next big client. I built their enterprise division from the ground up, landing accounts that kept the lights on and the investors happy. My specialty was the impossible deals, the ones that required months of relationship building, technical presentations that would make your head spin, and negotiations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Aero Logistics had been my white whale for 2 years, a massive freight company with operations across the western United States. Their CEO, Graham Larkin, was notorious for being difficult, demanding, and utterly uncompromising when it came to vendor relationships. 3 other software companies had tried and failed to win his business. But I understood something about Graham that others missed. He wasn't just buying software, he was buying trust. He needed to know that whoever handled his account would be there for the long haul, that they understood his business inside and out. So I spent months learning every detail of his operation, visiting their distribution centers, understanding their pain points, and building a solution that wasn't just good. It was perfect. Last Tuesday, after 18 months of courtship, I finally got the call. Graham's gravelly voice came through the phone. "Madeline, you've got yourself a deal, $2 million, just like we discussed." I nearly dropped the phone. It was the largest single contract in Sterling's history. Bigger than anything we'd closed all year. Hell, it was bigger than most of our quarterly revenues. I walked into the office Wednesday morning expecting congratulations. Maybe a bonus discussion, certainly some acknowledgement of what I'd just pulled off. Instead, I found an email in my inbox requesting my presence in conference room B at 9 a.m. sharp. The sender was Trent Marshall, the new vice president of strategic operations who'd been hired 3 months ago with his MBA and his consultancy background and his thinly veiled contempt for anyone who'd actually built relationships the old-fashioned way. The meeting was brief and brutal. "We're restructuring the sales division," Trent announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "The company is moving toward a more digital, automated approach to business development. We no longer need the traditional relationship manager model." He actually used air quotes. "No thank you for the 6 years. No acknowledgement of the $2 million I'd just delivered. Just a severance package, a non-disclosure agreement, and an escort to clean out my desk." As I packed my things, watching Trent through the glass walls as he glad-handed the executives about modernizing our approach, one thought kept circling through my mind. They had no idea what they'd just done. The termination meeting was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. Trent sat across from me with that practiced smile consultants perfect in business school, flanked by Rebecca from HR, a woman who'd avoided eye contact with me for 3 months, probably knowing this was coming. The conference room felt smaller than usual, the morning light streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. As I mentioned, we're pivoting toward a more streamlined, technology-driven sales model. Trent continued, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension that MBAs mistake for authority. "The days of the traditional account manager are behind us. Our clients want efficiency, not relationship theater." Relationship theater? I'd heard him use that phrase before, usually when he thought I couldn't hear him talking to the other executives. To him, my years of building trust with clients, understanding their businesses, solving their actual problems, all of that was just theater. "What about continuity?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Aero Logistics specifically requested that I remain their primary contact. Graham Larkin made that clear in our final negotiations. Trent waved his hand dismissively. We'll transition the account to our new digital platform. These Fortune 500 CEOs adapt quickly. They understand progress when they see it. I almost laughed. Graham Larkin had spent our first 3 meetings explaining why he'd fired the last 2 vendors for exactly this kind of corporate arrogance. He'd looked me in the eye and said, "If you're not the one handling my account, we don't have a deal." But Trent didn't know that. He'd never bothered to read the meeting notes, never sat in on the calls, never understood that some clients still valued the human element in business. "Your final day is today." Rebecca finally spoke up, sliding a manila folder across the table. "We'll need your laptop, keycard, and company phone. Security will escort you out after you've packed your personal items." The escort was unnecessary, a theatrical touch that Trent probably thought would prevent me from causing a scene. But I wasn't going to cause a scene. I was too busy thinking about the specific wording of the Aero contract, the clauses I'd negotiated personally with Graham, the details that existed only in my head and in the legal documents that Trent had clearly never bothered to examine. As I cleaned out my desk, I could see Trent through the glass walls of his office, already on the phone with someone, probably spinning his narrative about how he'd optimized the sales team. His gestures were animated, confident. He looked like a man who believed he'd just pulled off a brilliant strategic move. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 6 years, I'd been Sterling's top performer precisely because I paid attention to details that others missed. I read every contract, understood every clause, anticipated every potential issue. It's what made me good at my job. It's also what was about to make me very good at destroying theirs. Walking out of that building for the last time, carrying my box of personal items past the security guard's sympathetic nod, I felt something I hadn't expected. Clarity, not anger, not even sadness. Just a cold, crystalline understanding of exactly what needed to happen next. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and my personal laptop, pulling up the digital copy of the Aero Logistics contract I'd saved to my private cloud storage. Old habits, I'd always kept backups of my major deals, partly for my own records and partly because I'd learned not to trust corporate IT systems during transitions. The contract was 47 pages of dense legal language, but I knew every word. I'd written most of it myself, working late into the night to craft terms that would satisfy Graham's exacting standards while protecting Sterling's interests. What I was looking for was buried on page 32. In a section that most people would skip over as standard boilerplate, there it was, Section 12.4, Service Integrity and Personnel Continuity. The clause read, "In recognition of the personal relationship and specialized knowledge required for this engagement, client acknowledges that the primary account manager, Madeline Carter, is integral to service delivery. Should Sterling Dynamics remove or reassign the designated account manager within 90 days of contract execution without client's written consent, this agreement shall be deemed void ab initio. Furthermore, Sterling Dynamics shall be liable for liquidated damages equal to 10 times the contract value, representing anticipated losses from service disruption and the cost of transitioning to alternative vendors. 10 times the contract value. $20 million. I remembered the negotiation clearly. Graham had been burned by 2 previous vendors who'd switched account managers mid-implementation, leaving him to start over with people who didn't understand his business. "If you're not the one managing this relationship," he'd said, "then we don't have a deal. Make sure that's crystal clear in the contract." I'd thought it was standard client paranoia, the kind of protective language that would never actually matter. Sterling would never be stupid enough to fire their top performer right after landing their biggest deal. But then again, I'd never met Trent Marshall. The beautiful irony was that Trent had probably never read past the first few pages of the contract. He'd seen the $2 million figure, maybe skimmed the delivery timeline, and assumed he understood the deal. That was his style, big picture thinking, strategic vision. Leave the details to subordinates. Except now the subordinate who knew the details was gone. I took another sip of wine and scrolled through my contacts until I found Graham's direct number. It was after business hours, but Graham was a workaholic who told me to call any time. He picked up on the second ring. "Madeline, How's the celebration going over there? Actually, Graham, that's why I'm calling. I've got some news you're not going to like. I explained the situation quickly and professionally. Graham listened without interrupting, but I could hear his breathing getting sharper as I talked. Let me get this straight, he said finally. They fired you? The day after we signed? That's correct. And they think they can just assign someone else to my account? That appears to be their plan. There was a long pause. When Graham spoke again, his voice was ice cold. Well, I guess they're about to learn why I put that clause in there. You still have your copy of the contract? I do. Good. Send me the relevant section. I'll have my legal team draft the termination notice tonight. And Madeline? Make sure Sterling gets a copy too. I want them to understand exactly what their strategic restructuring just cost them. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. Graham had texted me at 6 a.m. Legal team reviewed everything. We're pulling the trigger. Want to do the honors? I spent an hour crafting the email, choosing each word carefully. This wasn't about emotion or revenge. It was about business, cold, calculated, and absolutely devastating. The subject line was simple. Notice of Contract Termination and Damage Assessment. Aero Logistics Agreement, AL 2024-087. I addressed it to Sterling's general counsel, copying Trent, the CEO, and the entire executive team. If they wanted to play corporate games, I'd show them how it was done. Dear Sterling Dynamics legal team, please be advised that effective immediately, Aero Logistics is exercising its right to terminate contract AL 2024-0087 under Section 12.4, Service Integrity and Personnel Continuity. As stipulated in the agreement, the removal of the designated account manager, Madeline Carter, within 90 days of contract execution without client consent constitutes a material breach. Per the liquidated damages clause, Sterling Dynamics is liable for compensation equal to 10 times the contract value. Total amount due, $20,000, $20 million. Aero Logistics legal counsel will be in contact within 24 hours to discuss payment arrangements. Please have your authorized representatives prepared to address this matter urgently. Additionally, Aero Logistics will be issuing a statement to industry publications regarding this breach of contract, as transparency in vendor relationships is crucial for our sector's integrity. We trusted Sterling Dynamics with our most critical operations. That trust has been irreparably damaged. Sincerely, Madeline Carter, former Director of Business Development, Sterling Dynamics, acting as authorized representative of Aero Logistics. I attached the relevant contract pages, highlighted the specific clause, and included Graham's signed authorization letter confirming my representation in this matter. Everything was airtight, professional, and utterly damning. Before hitting send, I paused. Once this email went out, there would be no going back. Sterling would be facing a financial crisis that could potentially bankrupt them. Trent's career would be over. People I'd worked with for years would suffer. But then I thought about yesterday morning. The dismissive wave of Trent's hand, relationship theater, the security escort, the complete lack of acknowledgement for 6 years of dedication and the biggest deal in company history. I clicked send. Within minutes, my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Sterling's main number, then Trent's extension, then numbers I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail. An hour later, Graham called. "It's done," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. My legal team just spoke with Sterling's counsel. They're in full panic mode. Apparently, nobody on their executive team knew about the penalty clause. What did they say? A lot of stammering about reviewing the situation and exploring options. Their lawyer asked if we'd consider a settlement. I told them we'd consider $20 million, paid in full, exactly as the contract specifies. I found myself smiling for the first time in days. And the industry statement? Going out this afternoon. I'm calling it The Importance of Honoring Vendor Relationships in Supply Chain Management. Should make for interesting reading at the next logistics conference. After hanging up, I poured myself a coffee and watched the sunrise through my apartment window. Somewhere across town, Trent Marshall was probably having the worst morning of his professional life. The thought didn't make me feel guilty. It made me feel vindicated. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's being smarter than the people who underestimated you. The fallout was swift and brutal. By noon, my LinkedIn was flooded with messages from former colleagues, industry contacts, and recruiters who'd heard whispers about what was happening at Sterling. The logistics world is smaller than people think, and news travels fast when a $20 million penalty clause gets triggered. The first public sign of Sterling's crisis came at 2:47 p.m. when trading in their stock was temporarily halted. When it resumed an hour later, shares had dropped 15% in the first 10 minutes. By market close, they were down 18%, wiping out nearly $80 million market value. My former assistant, Sarah, texted me around 3 p.m. "Holy shit, Madeline." The whole executive floor is in meltdown. Trent's been in the CEO's office for 2 hours. People are saying lawyers are flying in from New York. I'd worked with Sarah for 3 years. She was smart, loyal, and had always been my eyes and ears in the office. Her next message made me smile. "Also, everyone's asking where you are. Half the sales team is updating their resumes." The industry publication that Graham had promised came out at 4 p.m. Supply Chain Weekly ran the story with the headline, "Sterling Dynamics faces 20 body hours penalty after firing key account manager." The article was devastating in its simplicity, laying out the facts without editorial commentary. Sometimes the truth is damaging enough on its own. But the real earthquake hit the next morning. Forbes had picked up the story, and their angle was even more brutal. How poor management decisions cost Sterling Dynamics $20 million in 24 hours. The article interviewed several industry analysts who questioned Sterling's leadership and strategic direction. One particularly cutting quote came from a venture capital partner. "This isn't just about a contract dispute. This is about a fundamental misunderstanding of how B2B relationships work in 2024. My phone rang at 8 a.m. The caller ID showed Sterling's CEO, Marcus Webb, a man I'd barely spoken to in 6 years, despite bringing in millions in revenue. "Madeline, we need to talk." "I'm not sure there's anything to discuss." "Marcus, everything I had to say was in yesterday's email." "Look, I know how this looks, but there's been a misunderstanding. Trent didn't understand the full scope of your client relationships. We want to make this right." I almost laughed. $20 million would make it right. That's what the contract specifies. Come on, be reasonable. That clause was meant to be protective language, not a nuclear option. Nobody expected what, Marcus? That you'd fire your top performer the day after she closed your biggest deal? You're right, that was unexpected. The desperation in his voice was palpable. What would it take to make this go away? Your job back, a promotion, equity options? It's not my decision anymore. Aero Logistics has engaged their legal team. Graham Larkin doesn't negotiate with companies that break their word. After I hung up, I made myself breakfast and scrolled through the mounting coverage. TechCrunch had run a piece about toxic corporate culture in software companies. Supply Chain Management Review published an editorial about the importance of relationship continuity in enterprise sales. By afternoon, 3 more of Sterling's major clients had called to reassess their vendor relationships. The damage was spreading beyond the immediate penalty. Trent Marshall's LinkedIn profile went dark that evening. Sarah texted me one final update. He's gone, cleaned out his office after lunch, security escort, and everything. The irony wasn't lost on me. Exactly 48 hours after I'd been escorted out of the building, Trent got the same treatment. Sometimes karma doesn't just come back, sometimes it comes back with compound interest. A week later, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. When I answered, I immediately recognized the voice, strained, defeated. Nothing like the confident executive who'd fired me. "Madeline, it's Trent. Can we talk?" I considered hanging up, but curiosity got the better of me. "What's there to talk about, Trent?" Look, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but this has gotten out of hand. Can we meet? Just to clear the air. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a coffee shop downtown, far from Sterling's offices. When I arrived, Trent was already there, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past week. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled. The man who'd sat across from me with such arrogance was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely broken. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't." He stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. "I want you to know that firing you wasn't personal. It was a business decision based on market trends and efficiency models. I truly believed we were modernizing the company. And now? Now I realize I made a catastrophic error in judgment." He looked up at me with hollow eyes. "I never read the full contract. I assumed it was standard boilerplate language. My assistant usually handles those details." I felt a cold satisfaction hearing him admit it. "So you fired the person who knew the details without bothering to learn them yourself?" "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. "And it's cost me everything: my job, my reputation, my future in this industry. The board made me the scapegoat for the entire situation. That's unfortunate. Marcus is telling everyone that I went rogue, that the firing wasn't authorized by senior management. He's throwing me under the bus to save his own skin." I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch between us. This was the man who'd called my life's work relationship theater, who'd dismissed 6 years of dedication with a wave of his hand. "What do you want from me, Trent?" "I need you to know that I understand now. What you did with Aero Logistics, the relationships you built, that wasn't theater. It was real business value that I was too arrogant to recognize." "You're right. It was. Is there any way to make this right? I know I can't undo what happened, but maybe there's a way to..." "To what? Make the $20 million disappear? Repair Sterling's reputation? Get your job back?" He nodded desperately. I set down my coffee cup and looked him directly in the eye. "You should have thought about that before you decided to fire the person who wrote the contract." I stood up to leave, then paused. "You know what the real irony is, Trent? If you'd bothered to read that contract, you would have discovered that I structured it to protect Sterling as much as Aero. There are penalty clauses that work both ways, performance guarantees that would have locked in recurring revenue for years. It wasn't just a $2 million deal, it was the foundation for a $20 million relationship." His face went pale as the full magnitude of what he'd destroyed became clear. "But you'll never know what that would have looked like, will you?" I left him sitting there with his cold coffee and the wreckage of his career, finally understanding the true cost of his arrogance. 6 months later, Sterling Dynamics was a shadow of its former self. The $20 million penalty had triggered a cascade of financial problems that forced them to lay off nearly 40% of their workforce. 3 more major clients had terminated their contracts, citing concerns about operational stability. Marcus Webb resigned in disgrace, and the company was eventually acquired by a competitor for a fraction of its previous value. Trent Marshall never recovered professionally. Word travels fast in the corporate world, and his name became synonymous with catastrophic mismanagement. The last I heard, he'd left Denver entirely, trying to rebuild his career in a different industry where his reputation hadn't preceded him. As for me, I landed on my feet better than I could have imagined. Brightwell Partners, a boutique consulting firm specializing in enterprise software implementations, had been following the Sterling story closely. They reached out 2 weeks after the Forbes article ran, offering me a position as their director of client relations, with equity, full autonomy, and a salary that was double what Sterling had been paying me. "We need someone who understands that relationships aren't just nice to have in this business," their CEO told me during my interview. "They're everything." Graham Larkin became my first client at Brightwell, and our successful partnership opened doors to opportunities I'd never imagined. Word of mouth in the logistics industry is powerful, and soon I was managing accounts worth more than Sterling's entire annual revenue. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sterling had fired me to modernize their approach. But what they'd actually done was eliminate the very thing that made them competitive. In trying to cut costs, they'd destroyed their most valuable asset, trust. I kept one memento from my Sterling days, a framed copy of that contract clause, Section 12.4, hanging in my new office. It serves as a daily reminder that details matter, that relationships have value, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's being better than the people who underestimated you. Every time a new client asks me about my approach to account management, I tell them the same thing. I read every contract, understand every detail, and never forget that behind every business relationship is a human being who deserves respect. It's a lesson that cost Sterling Dynamics $20 million to learn, but it's served me well ever since. Some people call it karma. I call it business. Thank you for listening to this story of workplace revenge and corporate justice. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this from? Are you dealing with your own workplace challenges, or do you have a revenge story of your own? Please subscribe to hear more stories like this one, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's build a community where we can discuss the real dynamics of modern corporate life.